Thank you, Peirce, for offering me the opportunity to do this keynote. It's fantastic to be here and also to be part of this conference. I'm learning a lot. So I just want to say, to begin with, a few words about my intellectual journey and how I came to work on Peirce. I grew up in Australia and I was doing my PhD at the ANU. I was being trained up as an analytical philosopher, and I was working, as so many do, on the question of realism. And at some point, I started to feel dissatisfied and bogged down, as if the debates were missing something that I couldn't quite articulate. And in this regard, I really liked something that Michael said in his presentation about a distinction that you can draw between a critical reading and a productive reading. And I think that is what I was missing. Not to say that reading critically is not important, it's very important, but it's the productive reading that I was missing. So I started reading around, and at that time I went to Boston on exchange. I was at MIT for 6 months, and I thought, when in Rome, read the philosophy that was written there. So I started reading American Pragmatism, a lot of which came out of that intellectual community around Boston, Massachusetts. So I read Emerson, and I read Thoreau, and I went to Walden Pond and walked around. I read William James, and then I read Peirce. And once I started reading Peirce, there was no going back for me. There was a richness and a depth there, and a systematic philosophy, which I think has been lost on the analytic side of philosophy. So what I would like to do with this talk is to try to give you some sense of what about Peirce's philosophy I find exciting, inspiring, and productive. Okay, so this is my clicker. I haven't used one of these before, actually. So an overview of what I'm going to talk about. A few words in the beginning about the whole issue of truth as a philosophical topic. What are we doing as philosophers with truth? Then I want to present to you a famous definition of truth by Peirce and talk a little bit about what it means. And that will draw in some of Peirce's pragmatism, his idea of fallibilism, the idea that we must always accept that we can be wrong about any of our beliefs, and the idea of the end of inquiry, which is a famous slogan connected with Peirce's account of truth and what that means exactly. Then I'll consider some objections to Peirce's theory or Peirce's account of truth and some responses to those objections. And I'm going to finish with some thoughts about our conference theme here, philosophies of engagement, and what Peirce might have to offer in that regard. So, truth as a philosophical topic. I was recently presenting on truth to a group of non-philosophers. So these were actually teachers, and this was part of a training day for philosophy for children that I was helping Vanya Kovac in Auckland, if any of you know her. And so, because they hadn't studied any philosophy, playfully I said to them, I offered to tell them everything you ever wanted to know about truth, but didn't have a philosopher to ask. And I was interested in what that would be, those initial questions. And this led me to reflect on my own philosophical practice, thinking and writing about truth. And I know that, if you look at the journals, philosophical journals, there's so much writing and publishing about truth. But I wonder whether we often take a step back and think about what are we actually trying to do, trying to solve the problem of truth in philosophy. So what questions are we trying to answer? What problems are we trying to solve exactly? And if we were to solve the problem of truth in philosophy, what would that look like? What would be on the other side? And we might also ask, is the concept of a theory of truth even coherent? We want to think that our theories are true, but then what does a theory of truth mean? Now, one approach that has often been taken by philosophers to truth is either consciously or unconsciously is to try to come up with some kind of criterion of truth. So this would be some kind of desideratum that we could apply to our beliefs and determine whether those beliefs are true. Or maybe that's too much to ask, we could maybe determine whether they're more likely to be true. So we might say something like a belief is true if and only if it is sufficiently well justified, or it is caused by the things that it is about, or that it is self-evident, or that it is socially accepted in the right way. You can see all of these options being tried in the literature. But what I see as one of the biggest lessons of pragmatism is give up the search for a criteria of truth. This is a pipe dream. But does that mean we should stop talking about truth altogether as philosophers? I think no. Some pragmatists have taught that. A key example is Rorty. Rorty said, "It is true is not a helpful explanation of why science works or why you should share one of my beliefs." But Peirce's pragmatism shows us another way. So at this point, I get to introduce Peirce a little bit. He was writing in the second half of the 19th century, and he was highly trained and highly skilled. He came from a very scientific pedigree. His father was the top mathematician in the United States and had a position at Harvard. So Peirce grew up in a household where top thinkers were coming for dinner and chatting about all kinds of things. And he made contributions to philosophy, logic, mathematics, chemistry, cartography, psychology, and even more. So he was some kind of genius, but the end of his life was not terribly happy. There was a sense in which he was too intelligent to work in a university, unfortunately. So anyway, in 1934, the philosopher Paul Weiss called Peirce the most original and versatile of American philosophers and America's greatest logician, and I think that's true. So that's what I'm telling you. Peirce placed logic, interestingly, he placed logic within a broader context of semiotics or a theory of signs. So I'm not going to talk about that today, but I want to acknowledge Inna Sametsky. Inna Sametsky has been doing a lot of work exploring that side of Peirce's thought and making connections between Peirce's semiotics and education. But today I'm going to talk more about Peirce's pragmatism and how it informs his understanding of truth. Because Peirce was the founder of pragmatism. He didn't popularise it as much as William James. William James was a close friend of Peirce, and initially William James's writings on pragmatism were more widely known, but it was Peirce who had the original idea and who gave it a name. So now I'm going to present to you Peirce's definition of truth. So this is a famous, it's not the only definition, but this is a very famous definition from early in Peirce's career. So he says, "The opinion which is fated to be ultimately agreed to by all who investigate is what we mean by the truth." So this is a very, very carefully chosen, all the words in this statement. And it's worth looking at carefully. And so we could say, truth is what lies at the limit of inquiry, hence the title of my talk. So there's a number of things we could notice here. We could notice that the definition links to a community, all who investigate. This is the community of inquiry. And this idea also was originated by Peirce. So notice that truth is public, truth belongs to a community, and truth is public. Secondly, it links to a process, the process of inquiry, what would be ultimately agreed to. So truth and agreement are linked in this definition. And so truth is not something static. It's something dynamic in this sense. Thirdly, it links to the future. So there's this term fated to be ultimately agreed to by all who investigate. And again, this is quite an original move that Peirce is making to link truth into the future. It's a teleological move that he's making. Now, some people don't like this idea of fatedness, this term very much. And Peirce thought about this through his life. And towards the end of his life, he softened the idea of fatedness a little bit, or at least clarified what he meant. And he said he wasn't talking about will be, he was talking more about would be. So here is what he says later on in 1901. He says, if truth consists in satisfaction, it cannot be any actual satisfaction, but must be the satisfaction which would ultimately be found if inquiry were pushed to its ultimate and indefeasible issue. So he's not saying, he's not making a prediction about what will be agreed to, but he's saying what we mean by the truth is what would be agreed to if there was enough inquiry into the matter. Okay, so that's the definition. Now I'm going to talk about the link with pragmatism. So Peirce wrote a famous paper called How to Make Our Ideas Clear, and that's what this definition comes from. But it shouldn't be thought that Peirce thought that pragmatism offers a theory of truth, and here he differs from James and Rorty. Peirce's definition is not a theory of truth, so much as a claim that this is what we mean by the truth. So the idea of his paper, How to Make Our Ideas Clear, was just to give us some ideas about how to make our ideas clear. And the tool that he's offering is called the pragmatic maxim. So Peirce's pragmatism is not really about truth. Peirce's pragmatism is about meaning and how to make it clear. So the pragmatic maxim, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it says, consider what effects that might conceivably have practical bearings we conceive the object of our conception to have, then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object. That's just a way of saying that if you want to understand a concept, think of what it would lead you to expect in a specific situation. So Peirce lays out what he thinks are three grades of clarity of meaning that our concepts can have. So the first grade of clarity is if you can identify instances of a concept without necessarily being able to say why. So there was a famous remark by a judge in the obscenity trial for Lady Chatterley's lover, and they were trying to define pornography, and the judge said, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it. So that's the first grade of clarity. The second grade is when you can give some kind of verbal definition that you might find in a dictionary. And this is where most philosophy stops, interestingly. And we all know how you can have that experience where you look up a term in the dictionary and you see it's defined in terms of other terms, and then you look up those terms in the dictionary, and then they are defined back in terms of the first set of terms, and you can end up going in a circle. So to get beyond the second grade of clarity is the pragmatic maxim. Think of future expectations from hypotheses containing that concept. And Peirce argued that this is how scientists think, and this is what distinguishes the natural sciences from philosophy, at least in his day. So just to give you an example, the everyday concept hard, first grade of clarity, this table is hard. This is an example of hardness. Second grade, you might say something like, hardness consists in the ability to resist pressure, something you might read in a dictionary. The third grade is to come up with some expectation. So if I put my dinner plate on this table, then the dinner plate won't fall through if the table is hard. So the pragmatic maxim is not just intended for everyday practical concepts. Peirce was hoping that it could be used in philosophy to make difficult philosophical concepts clear. he says, the very first lesson that we have a right to demand that logic shall teach us is how to make our ideas clear. This is a different conception of logic than the novel. And he also adds this observation. He says, it's most easily learned by those whose ideas are meagre and restricted. Far happier they than such as wallow helplessly in a rich mud of conceptions. It's not something you often hear a philosopher saying. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about Peirce's fallibilism. So we've seen that inquiry for Peirce is a process, and we never reach a point where we have the entire truth and inquiry can cease. So the definition of truth always points into the future. And given that we manage to negotiate the world without too many nasty surprises, we can assume that many of our beliefs are true. So this is the pragmatism. Knowledge is successful interaction with the world, and insofar as we are successfully interacting with the world, not just acting as a spectator on that world, we can assume that we have some knowledge. But we can never be sure which of our beliefs are the true ones. And this is Peirce's commitment to fallibilism. And this applies right across the board to any belief whatsoever. Mathematics, logic, anything. So this commitment to fallibilism is operationalised in the way that Peirce understands the community of inquiry. So he understands the community of inquiry as containing infinitely many inquirers, or indefinitely many inquirers, and stretching across infinite time or indefinite amount of time. So this is a way of capturing the idea that no matter how wide a consensus exists on a given belief, it's always possible that another person might come along at a later time and find a problem and end up convincing everyone, and the belief will be overturned. And Peirce thought that this fallibilism was one of the most important ideas structuring the development of his philosophy. So you might say at this point, well, that's easy to say, this is all very idealised, there's this community of inquiry and they're heading into the future and they're going to find all the answers at some, wonderful future time. But what about some guidance now for us in how to inquire? What does the community of inquiry actually do? Peirce doesn't seem to be saying very much about that. So don't we need some guidelines so that inquirers don't wander off into some fantasy world or something? In a way, Peirce bites this bullet due to his pragmatism. He says whatever the community of inquiry does to begin with, in the long run, they will be led towards the truth because they are all interacting with the same world. So this daily interaction with the real world sort of makes the problems with your beliefs unavoidable. Eventually, you're going to have to improve your beliefs together, and you're going to find a way to do that. But in a paper entitled "The Fixation of Belief," he does give some guidance. So this is also a very famous early paper. So in this paper, he analyses a belief as a habit. And this is also a bit unique to pragmatism. So a belief is not a proposition in your head, which is how belief is often, whatever that means, which is how belief is often thought of in the analytic tradition. But a belief is a stable pattern in your actual ways of acting. So if you have a particular habit of acting, then you have the corresponding belief, whether or not you think you do. And if you don't have the habit, then you don't have the belief, even if you think you do. So think about belief. Belief in God is an interesting one to think about in this regard. Doubt, on the other hand, is an unsettled state. A doubt is a lack of a habit or a disruption to a habit when suddenly where you had a habit and then suddenly you don't know if you can rely on that habit anymore. And there's something intrinsically irritating about that state to the human being. And Peirce makes an important distinction between genuine or living doubt and false or paper doubt based on whether you really are unsettled or not. And Gil Berg was talking about this in his paper. Where's Gil here? I think I saw him. Oh, there you are. Yes, you were talking about that also in your paper on pragmatism. Okay, so if we think of belief as habit and we think of doubt as an irritating, unsettled state, then the problem of inquiry just becomes a problem of how to fix belief and how to get rid of the irritation of doubt. And Peirce analyses that problem into 4 main strategies that you might use to fix, so-called fixed belief. So the first strategy, whatever you happen to believe now, hang on to it and refuse to consider any contrary evidence. This is the method of tenacity. And we all know people who use this strategy. Maybe we've all used it ourselves in some situation. This is private because it's just your own beliefs, and it's random because, you know, the beliefs that you have, there's a certain randomness to the set of beliefs that you've happened to end up with. Secondly, you could find an institution that will tell you what to believe and believe what they tell you. This is the method of authority. Now, this is public because you're part of a community, an institution, but it's random insofar as if I'm born in a Catholic country, I will believe what the Catholic Church says I should believe, and if I'm born in a Muslim country, I'll believe what the Muslim community tells me to believe. Thirdly, I could believe whatever seems to me to be most coherent or elegant. Now we're starting to get more philosophical. This is called the a priori method. And this is Descartes in his study. So this is private and reasoned. So it's reasoned, but it's private. And then fourthly, and this is the one that Peirce is most recommending, join with others to formulate hypotheses about things whose characters are independent of our opinions about them, test the hypotheses and share the results with everyone. So he says this is the method of science. This is public and reasoned. And Peirce claims that all of these methods have their uses, but the method of science is the most effective over the long run at actually fixing belief, at actually removing doubt. So you can use the method of authority and it will remove your doubt to some degree, but it will never remove everybody's doubts over the long run. Okay, so where are we? Okay, I just want to say a little bit about this phrase, the end of inquiry, has entered the literature as a slogan for Peirce's understanding of truth. This phrase is crucially ambiguous. It's not end in the sense of finish. And so this would be some utopian future time where all questions are settled. And the end. But it is end in the teleological sense of aim or goal. So, what is someone's ends is their goals. It's merely an idealised continuation of what scientific inquirers are doing now. Namely, they're settling questions on which they have genuine doubts. It's a goal, and notice all the people that are carrying that goal. And this, so there's something that Russell had a crack at Peirce's account of truth, saying, because the last man on earth will presumably be entirely occupied in keeping warm and getting nourishment, it's doubtful whether his opinions will be any wiser than ours. So this kind of misses the point. Okay, so now I'm going to look at some objections to this account of truth and try to give you some answers. So some people have said that the way that the definition of truth draws on concepts of infinity makes it incoherent. So Rorty said, there can be no such thing as an ideal audience before whom justification would be sufficient to ensure truth, any more than there can be a largest integer. But we've already seen that the true meaning of end of inquiry is not a perfect final time where everyone knows everything, but it's precisely, it's not a finishing point, it's precisely the model which ensures that inquiry can keep continuing indefinitely. And then despite what word-based philosophers might think, thinking about infinity can be coherent and rigorous. Just think about the integral calculus. This is a very clever idea whereby trying to work out the area under a curve, and you add up, you divide it into slices, and then you work out the area of all the slices, and then you add them all up. And then you, with mathematical tools, you work out a way of making the slices smaller and smaller and smaller. And so you're getting more and more accurate. And as the slices become infinitesimally small, and there's an infinite number of them, you get the exact answer. So there's actually mathematical tools that can, where you can engage in an infinite adding process and yet finish it and get a finite answer. This is quite amazing, actually. Maybe philosophers should think more about these kinds of cases before criticising. Secondly, Quine says that the idea of approximation to a limit depends on nearer than, which is defined for numbers but not for theories. Well, it's true that we can't compare our current best theory and things in themselves and say, oh, well, it's 65% accurate, because there's no way that we can access things in themselves separate from our understanding of them. So the idea of things in themselves is useless metaphysics, and it's one of the concepts that Peirce thought his pragmatic maxim would help to sweep away. But we have the notion of a theory being nearer to the truth than your present theory, and this is pragmatically meaningful. What does it mean that a theory is nearer to the truth than your present theory? It just means that it solves some problem that the present theory doesn't. And here I want to point out that this is also where I think pragmatism gives you a better handle on scientific inquiry, insofar as it understands scientific inquiry as solving problems. This is what moves inquiry forward. So it's not just gathering, science is not just gathering facts. If you want to just gather facts, go and find a tree and count all the leaves on the tree, you'll get a lot of facts, but you won't, you won't move inquiry forward. So it's the key problems and recognising the key problems that's, half of the journey. So a second objection to Peirce's definition of truth is this idea of convergence. So the idea that our belief will settle on a single answer to any given question. Isn't this too big of an assumption? Again, Russell had some things to say. He said, is this an empirical generalisation from the history of research? Is it an optimistic belief in the perfectibility of man? Does it contain any element of prophecy, or is it merely a hypothetical statement of what would happen if men of science grew continually cleverer? And, that always happens. Even if we have convergence, why does it, have to be to a single answer? Couldn't we have some idea of pluralistic convergence? And so this objection is quite a powerful objection, and it moves a lot of people when they read Peirce. So I think the objection needs to be taken seriously. But in reply, I would want to fall back on the focus that Peirce's pragmatism puts on meaning. So if we look at the definition again, the definition says, the opinion which is fated to be ultimately agreed to by all who investigate is what we mean by the truth. So I said before that this is not a theory of truth. So it's not stating that convergence on a single opinion is what will happen, but it is stating that that is what we mean by the truth. So, and that's all it's saying. This is what we mean by the truth. So it's popular today to say something like, you believe P, and that is true for you, and I believe not P, and that is true for me. And this is something that first-year students naturally want to say, and it's often justified as respecting each other's beliefs. But I urge you to think about what it means pragmatically if we say this to one another. So we might have respect for one another's beliefs. We might, I'm not conceding that, but we lose the opportunity to learn from each other and both take our views further. So in this way, convergence is it's a regulative hope for our living together, I suppose, that a shared understanding might be possible. And living with that regulative hope is different than living without that regulative hope. And so we get to choose if we want to hold that hope or not. Okay. So here's a third objection. Interestingly, Peirce's definition of truth is criticised for being too realist with the idea of convergence, and then it's criticised by others for being not realist enough. So maybe that's a good sign. Anyway, so others have said, shouldn't truth be kept free of epistemic notions like belief and agreement within the community of inquiry? An analytic philosopher, Paul Horwich, has complained, truth has a certain purity. Interesting metaphor. Pure in what way? Not sure. But it seems to be expressing the worry that can't we at least imagine that the community of inquiry could all fail to agree on something that's true forever? And surely we can imagine that, and because we can imagine that, that means that Peirce's definition of truth doesn't quite capture what truth is. And this worry is often pressed with examples of so-called lost facts. So these are truths which it seems it would be clearly impossible to ever discover. Philosophers have had fun thinking of these kinds of examples. Jack Smart has the idea that Winston Churchill sneezed twice more on a certain date in 1941 than Franklin Roosevelt. Surely we can never know that. And yet surely there's a truth of the matter, one way or the other. Mark Johnston, the number of cakes on a particular tray at a specific time during a party held years ago. And then Hartree Field, the number of dinosaurs that ever existed. So in answer to that, Peirce says, not so fast. How do we know that we will never find out these things? So again, the fallibilism comes into play. So we need to be fallibilist about what we can't know, as well as being fallibilist about what we do know. So Peirce says, it's unphilosophical to suppose that with regard to any given question which has a clear meaning, the investigation would not bring forth a solution if it was carried far enough. Who can be sure of what we shan't know in a few hundred years? The history of inquiry is littered with embarrassing claims that a certain thing can never be found out, when actually it can. So Peirce had a nice example from his own time. Comte was asked to give an example of something which could clearly never be discovered, and he said, the chemical composition of stars, so whether the stars are made of carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and so forth, he said, we can never go to the stars, we're never going to know this. And then shortly after he wrote that and published it, the spectroscope was discovered, and that analyses the wavelength of light, and by using the spectroscope you can actually work out by the wavelengths of light what the stars are made of. So that was embarrassing. Okay, so to state categorically that certain facts can't ever be discovered is much worse, Peirce thought, than having a foolish idea that you can find something out. He says, there's no positive sin against logic in trying any theory which may come into our heads, as long as it's adopted in such a sense as to permit the investigation to go on unimpeded. On the other hand, to set up a philosophy which barricades the road of further advance towards the truth is the one unpardonable offence in reasoning. So, you know, the open-mindedness here is something I really appreciate about Peirce. And similarly, this is a very famous quote. He says, the sole rule of reason, and this is really interesting, I think, the sole rule of reason is that in order to learn, you must desire to learn, and in so desiring, not be satisfied with what you already inclined to think. There follows one corollary which should be inscribed upon every wall of the city of philosophy. Do not block the way of inquiry. Okay, so I'm just going to finish off now with some thoughts. These are sort of just impressionistic, I suppose, very broad thoughts about our idea of a philosophy of engagement. So we've seen that Peirce's fallibilism teaches that there's no criterion of truth. This means that the solution for poor opinions is not attempting to dictate methods that must be followed to avoid error. And this is such a natural thing to do. But Peirce teaches, to question this. So one might dub this epistemic managerialism. So this is just a term that I've just thought of, but it connects, I think, with some of the work that Michael and Tina have been doing in knowledge capitalism. So if you have knowledge capitalism, then one of your maybe dangers is going to be epistemic managerialism. And I think about this a lot in terms of our current university structures, and I think about our increasing requirement to justify everything that we're going to research before we research it. The whole, grant-getting system that we're increasingly, forced to work within. So the solution for poor opinions is more opinions. Apply more perspectives to the problem and trust the process of inquiry. This is how Peirce's understanding of truth is a philosophy of engagement, it seems to me. As pragmatists, we trust that as we're all located in the one world and interacting with that world on a daily basis, false beliefs will be found to have uncomfortable consequences, cause the irritation of doubt, and this will motivate us to correct them. If a belief is never found to have uncomfortable consequences by any person across all time, what does it mean to say that the belief is false? So, implications for education. Our great task as teachers is not to endow students with the truth. I mean, I'm sure many people here are thinking along these lines. Our task is not even to endow students with a fail-safe algorithm for finding the truth. Now, this is a further step. And both of these, I think, can be thought of as this banking model of education. Again, Gil, I appreciated you raising that in your talk, and that's kind of why I've put that in here. Much mainstream epistemology in mainstream philosophy, as it's done in Australia and New Zealand today, with its talk of finding prior justifications and warrants for our beliefs, is enormously misleading on this point. And here my talk connects with Tracy Bowles' keynote yesterday. So there was something she said, which I wrote down. She said, modernist epistemology demands indefeasible reasons for believing. I thought that was nicely put. So the truth or otherwise of our beliefs does not lie in their immediate past in this way, but it lies in their future, which no one can predict. Our task is to invite students into the community of inquiry, to stand and inquire alongside us. And to the degree that we are able to do this, and I acknowledge that it's not easy, and it's not always comfortable, but to the degree that we are able to do this, the end result will surprise and excite all of us. And these are the most exciting classes, transformative in fact. So just some closing thoughts on the university, because I know that this is, again, something that, that the participants in this PISA community are thinking critically about the university and how it should be arranged and what are the implications for education. And I really appreciate that, politically informed critique. So Peirce had some stringent things to say about what he thought about the university even in his day, coming out of his fallibilism. So he says, the first thing that the will to learn supposes is a dissatisfaction with one's present state of opinion. There lies the secret of why it is that our American universities are so miserably insignificant. The English universities, rotting with sloth as they always have, you see now why he was not always popular in the academic world, but accurate, I think, have nevertheless in the past given birth to Locke and to Newton. The German universities have been the light of the whole world. The medieval university of Bologna gave Europe its system of law. Some more examples. And then he continues, the reason was that they were institutions of learning, while ours are institutions for teaching. In order that a man's whole heart may be in teaching, he must be thoroughly imbued with the vital importance and absolute truth of what he has to teach. While in order that he may have any success in learning, he must be penetrated with a sense of the unsatisfactoriness of his present condition of knowledge. The two attitudes are almost irreconcilable. I find this very personally challenging, but in a good way. So it seems that Peirce wanted to encourage more genuine inquiry to take place in universities. But it's important to note that once again, the answer is not the epistemic managerialism or planning how to inquire. When conditions are right, inquiry will grow, he thought. And so he thought a lot in biological metaphors, actually. So here's what he said. He was also thinking very much in terms of Darwin's theory of evolution, which was new in, when he was a young man, and it was enormously exciting when Darwin's theory emerged and, changed the intellectual landscape very much in the 19th century. He says, inquiry of every type fully carried out has the vital power of self-correction and growth. This is a property so deeply saturating its inmost nature that it may truly be said there is but one thing needful for learning the truth, and that is a hearty and active desire to learn what is true. If you really want to learn the truth, you will, by however devious a path, be surely led into the way of truth at last. No matter how erroneous your ideas of the method may be at first, you will be forced at length to correct them so long as your activity is moved by that sincere desire. Even if you only half desire it at first, that desire would at length conquer all others, could experience continued long enough. Okay, great. Yep, I'm nearly finished. So I just want to remark, actually, that, to me it stands out, these sort of biological metaphors for education and learning. And I was reflecting as I was making this slide how rare that is, and so often, education seems to be discussed in terms of somehow building a machine or producing products, in a manufacturing situation, and how rare, you might think of education in terms of maybe a gardening metaphor, and how different as it is here, and how different that would be if we thought that way. So, oh yes, it's inquiry growing. So, yeah, this is the end of my talk. This talk comes from a paper that I recently published in the journal Philosophy Compass, and it's called Charles Peirce's Limit Concept of Truth. So if you found this talk interesting, you might like to look up the paper. Thank you very much.